In December 1942, Second Lieutenant John George arrived on Guadalcanal with something no other officer in his battalion had. Not a better rank, not a fancier uniform, not even better training. A mail-order rifle. It was a Winchester Model 70 hunting rifle, the kind a civilian might buy to hunt deer back home in Illinois, the kind that when he showed it to the other officers, they laughed at. They called it a toy. They called it his mail-order sweetheart. One seasoned armorer looked at it and asked if he was planning to hunt German soldiers or just shoot rabbits. What happened in the 4 days that followed would prove every single one of them wrong. 11 confirmed kills. In 4 days, using a rifle that the entire U.S. Army had officially rejected as unsuitable for combat. This is the true story of how one man's refusal to accept military orthodoxy and a civilian hunting rifle with a civilian scope changed the way the U.S. military understood sniping forever. This is John George. John George was born in an America that understood shooting. His childhood wasn't spent in cities. It was spent in places where a rifle wasn't a weapon. It was a tool. Marksmanship wasn't something you learned in the army. It was something you learned from your father or your grandfather or a neighbor who knew how. By the time George was a teenager, he wasn't just good at shooting. He was exceptional. The kind of marksman who didn't just hit targets, who understood the mechanics of accuracy in a way most people never would. In 1939, at 23 years old, George won the Illinois State Rifle Championship at 1,000 yards, youngest winner in the state's history. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards using nothing but iron sights. At 300 yards, he could put 5 consecutive rounds inside 4 inches. These weren't accidents. These were the results of obsession. George joined the Illinois National Guard before the war broke out, not because he thought war was coming, most Americans didn't, but because the Guard gave him access to the one thing he loved, shooting. Better rifles, better ranges, better competitors. He would spend hours studying ballistics, wind correction, distance estimation. While other soldiers complained about training, George studied. While other officers went drinking, George went to the range. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Suddenly, the National Guard wasn't a hobby anymore. It was the Army. George's unit, the 132nd Infantry Regiment of the Illinois National Guard, was mobilized. In late 1942, they were ordered to the Pacific. But before they shipped out, George did something that would define his entire war. He took 2 years of his National Guard pay money he'd saved penny by penny, and he bought a Winchester Model 70 hunting rifle, not a military rifle, not a service weapon, a civilian hunting rifle. The Winchester Model 70 was considered the finest commercial bolt-action rifle ever made. Hunters loved it. Competitors used it. It was accurate, reliable, and built to precise tolerances. But it was not and never had been designed for military service. George paired it with a Lyman Alaskan scope, a hunting scope, 2.5 power magnification, not military grade, not issued by the Army, not part of any official equipment list. When the armorer saw George's rifle, he literally asked if it was meant for hunting deer or Germans. George didn't answer. He just smiled and carefully packed the Winchester in his baggage, but the ship sailed before his rifle arrived from the factory. For weeks, George didn't know if his most important possession would ever reach him. Then, on December 27, 1942, as the 132nd Infantry Regiment relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked F. Regile. Inside was the rifle he'd saved 2 years to buy, the rifle every officer in his battalion had mocked, the rifle the U.S. Army had officially rejected as unsuitable for combat. Guadalcanal was a nightmare, not because of the enemy, though the enemy was terrifying, because of everything else: disease, dysentery, malaria, heat that seemed to come from the earth itself, humidity so thick you couldn't breathe, jungle so dense you couldn't see 10 feet ahead of you. The Marines had held the island since August 1942. They'd taken Henderson Field and held it, but they hadn't cleared the Japanese. By the time the army arrived in December to relieve them, the Marines were exhausted, sick, and traumatized. The Japanese had retreated into the jungle, but they were still there, still dangerous, still capable of killing. George's battalion was tasked with clearing the remaining Japanese strongholds. First priority, Mount Austin, a 1,514-foot peak the Japanese had fortified with 47 bunkers and 500 men. The army attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. By the time they took the western slope on January 2nd, they'd lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded. George had fired his new Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. But the real nightmare was about to begin. West of Henderson Field in the coastal groves near Point Cruz, Japanese soldiers had dug into the massive banyan and coconut trees. They were snipers, not formally trained necessarily, but positioned, patient, and deadly. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander was losing men faster than malaria was killing them, and he was running out of options. The Japanese snipers had complete control of that jungle. They knew every tree, every firing position, every escape route. The commander needed someone who could shoot, someone who understood rifles better than anyone else in the entire regiment. Someone crazy enough to go out there alone. He called for John George. That night, George explained his credentials to the commander. Illinois State Championship, 1,000 yards. 6-inch groups at 600 yards, iron sights. The commander didn't care about credentials. He cared about results. He gave George until dawn to prove that his mail-order rifle could hit anything. George spent the night checking his Winchester, cleaning it again, checking the scope mounts, loading 5 rounds of .306 hunting ammunition he'd packed in Tennessee. He didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. This was what he'd been preparing for his entire life, not just to shoot, but to hunt men. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut and banyan groves west of Point Cruz. According to intelligence, the Japanese snipers were operating from the large trees in that area. Some of those banyan trees were 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one before dawn and sit there all day, completely invisible, completely secure, watching for anyone foolish enough to move. George had brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to watch the trees through his Lyman Alaskan scope. 2.5 power magnification, not much, but enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The jungle is never silent. George had learned to filter the noise, focus on movement, glass the tree slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it, a branch moving, no wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape, a man, dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met, facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies, a Japanese sniper. In perfect position, with no idea he was being watched, George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked. fell, dropped through the branches, 90 feet, hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George warped the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round, kept his scope on the tree, waited for movement. Nothing. But the sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, one shooter, one spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the trees nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish. At 9:40 a.m., he found the second sniper. Different tree. 60 yards north of the first, lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21 a.m., a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine. Shoot and relocate. But in a jungle, this dense relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38 a.m., third tree from the left in a cluster of 5, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers had adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, 4 p.m., he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 08:15 a.m. By 08:45 a.m., enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 09:12 a.m. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. Kill number 6. At 09:57 a.m., something changed. Japanese mortars opened fire. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. As the third salvo hit, the bunker he'd occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. It provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese had changed tactics. They now knew where George was. They were hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. A sniper's worst nightmare being hunted by the men you're hunting. At 2:23 p.m. kill number 7. At 3:41 p.m. kill number 8. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired. On January 24th and 25th, George was back in position. The Japanese were sending more snipers. Desperate now, they knew George was hunting them, but they had no choice. He was too effective. He had to be stopped, but the Winchester Model 70 was better than any rifle the Japanese had. The Lyman Alaskan scope was superior to Japanese optics. George's marksmanship, honed by 2 decades of competitive shooting, was something the Japanese hadn't trained for. Kill number 9. Kill number 10. And then, on the morning of January 25th, a final shot. A Japanese sniper who'd made the mistake of shifting positions slightly. George was watching, always patient. Kill number 11. In 4 days, using a rifle that the entire U.S. Army had officially rejected as unsuitable for combat, John George killed 11 confirmed Japanese snipers, 11 shots. 11 hits, a marksmanship record that, to this day, remains almost unmatched in American military history. More importantly, George proved something the military establishment desperately needed to learn: individual expertise, personal commitment, and the refusal to accept orthodoxy could accomplish more than any official doctrine. The battalion commander recommended him for a decoration. The Army's response was predictable. Commendations were for combat leaders, not snipers. George received no medal, no official recognition. But something had changed in the way the American military thought about sniping. Officers started asking questions. Why was this one man with a mail-order rifle more effective than dozens of officially trained snipers? What was he doing differently? The answer was simple. He was the best shooter in his unit, and he was given freedom to do what he did best. After Guadalcanal, George would go on to serve with the famous Merrill's Marauders in Burma, where his marksmanship continued to save lives. He finished the war as a lieutenant colonel. After returning home, he wrote a book called Shots Fired in Anger, one of the finest first-hand accounts of combat ever published. In that book, George recorded the lessons he'd learned. Not propaganda, not PR stories for the media. The actual truth of what war was like on the personal level. How much freedom a good soldier needs to be effective. How individual excellence can matter more than doctrine. He went to Princeton University after the war, graduated with highest honors, and spent the rest of his life in diplomacy and international affairs. He died in 2015. Having lived a full life far from the chaos of Guadalcanal. But his 4-day sniper duel would never be forgotten. John George did something the Army said was impossible. He took a rifle the military rejected as unsuitable for combat, a scope designed for hunting deer, a personal obsession with marksmanship that most officers dismissed as impractical, and he proved every military expert wrong. Not through luck, not through a single moment of heroism, but through discipline, preparation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence in a single specific thing: accurate rifle fire. In an age of official doctrine and military orthodoxy, one man with a Winchester Model 70 and 2 decades of shooting experience demonstrated that sometimes the greatest advantage in war isn't bigger, faster, or more official. It's better. They mocked his rifle. They called it a toy. They said the Army knew better. But in 4 days on Guadalcanal, John George proved them all wrong. With a mail-order rifle and a Lyman Alaskan scope, he changed the way America understood sniping. One shot at a time.